So for this talk, we have the pleasure of hearing Professor Manova. She's a professor of economics at University College London. And if you were to summarize her research on, let's say, 5 keywords, you could say international trade, global value chains, multinational firms, firm management and performance, firm heterogeneity, finance, and exports. So these are kind of topics on the kind of research that we generally do in India. This is kind of an area that is, we don't have much research going on, so it's going to be a real pleasure to hear this. And so in the intersection of these areas, she has published extensively in all our leading journals. Her path-breaking work has been acknowledged by prestigious prizes, fellowships, and grants. And she also serves on the editorial boards of our top journals. So on behalf of this conference, I welcome you here. So the speaker will speak for about 50 minutes and then 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this fantastic opportunity to be here. It's my very first time to India and to Delhi. It's an absolute joy. So my eyes are full of color and fun from the day of sightseeing that I have had. And I'm extremely grateful that you have decided to spend your Saturday afternoon here instead of enjoying the fun festival preparations out there. I'm very passionate about international trade and the study of international economics more generally. And in fact, those keywords are a perfect summary of what my current interests are. I think these are also the key questions at the research frontier in this literature. Today, I'd like to think about global innovation through the lens of global value chains, multinational activity, and more generally how globalization changes the way in which firms can operate, the way in which they can be profitable today, and the way in which they can invest today to improve their productivity and growth in the future. So I wasn't sure whether to go with an overview presentation or to delve into one particular project, so I decided to do a mix of both. I'll start by talking more broadly about what I think are the key ways in which globalization creates opportunities for global growth and innovation, and essentially provide a bit of a summary of a few different lines of research that I've been part of that tackle this question from different angles. And then in the second half of my talk, I will zoom in on one particular project that I'm currently working on and that I hope you will find interesting. So when we think about 20th century globalization and growth, the patterns are striking and very well established. There's a very strong correlation between growth in trade expansion, as measured in terms of trade as a share of GDP, and growth in terms of GDP per capita. So each dot here is a country, the size of the dot is the population. Of course, China and India stand out, and the color coding tells you that Asia has been driving this strong growth among emerging economies, with Africa in blue lagging behind. The 21st century creates new opportunities for globalization, new opportunities for global growth, along with new challenges. But being the perennial optimist, I'd like to think that the opportunities are actually quite significant, and the challenges is something that we can and should be tackling. So what are the key features of these new ways of globalizing? Well, there's been tremendous technological change that enables the fragmentation of production. So we have seen this rise in global production networks, value chains, supply chains, different terms, basically referencing the fact that we're increasingly splitting the whole production process across from boundaries and country borders. Multinationals have been a very important driver of this globalization, but not the only one. So about 2/3 of global trade is conducted among multinationals, some of that within firm boundaries between multinational affiliates, some of it at arm's length between multinationals and independent parties. But these are critical trends. And this has come together with deeper financial and labor market integration. However, it has also developed in the context of significant cross-country differences in institutional stability and market structures. And as a result of that, there are very intense policy debates about what is optimal for developed countries, what is optimal for developing countries, and what is optimal for the world overall. So global integration has been under fire, but I'd like to think that these opportunities for global growth will prevail. And in fact, towards the end of my talk, I'd like to suggest why, in fact, multilateralism has a lot to contribute in this regard. So why do I think that globalization can enable firm growth and therefore also aggregate economic growth? Well, production fragmentation can increase your productivity, your efficiency, given your current production technology. It can, in addition to that, enable you to improve your productivity, to upgrade your production technology, be it through adopting existing technologies of superior performers, or by being at the cutting edge and actually innovating, moving the frontier. From an individual firm's perspective, either of those would constitute technological change. For the world as a whole, we do need to think about the difference between innovation that's moving the global frontier and adoption, which is, laggard, sort of catching up to that frontier. So why is it that fragmenting production can enable more efficient performance at current production practices? Well, you have access to a wider range of inputs, cheaper inputs, higher quality inputs, and this will improve your capacity to produce higher quality at lower marginal cost. In addition to that, to the extent that firms typically producing technologies with economies of scale, when you have access to a bigger export market, this is going to enable you to reduce your average cost. Conversely, of course, we do need to remember that import competition may act in reverse and constrain your local market size. But more importantly, when we think about upgrading your technology, not just lowering the cost of your inputs and equipment, but actually actively changing the way you operate, what are some of the channels here? Well, innovation or technological adoption is costly. There's significant sunk upfront cost or fixed cost. Having access to a bigger export market is going to allow you to more easily amortize those costs. If you think about import competition, well, the decision whether or not to innovate is really one of comparing profits with and without innovation. It's possible that before the rise in import competition, it was actually better for you to stay put and not innovate because of the high innovation cost. Once you take import competition into account, however, you might actually be better off innovating to essentially remain competitive. Yes, you're still making possibly lower profits than prior to the rise in import competition, but you would be making higher profits if you do innovate than if you didn't. Okay, so different channels there. Integration in global production chains can also allow knowledge transfer. Some of that is active learning. A lot of it is foreign buyers or suppliers essentially teaching you about the specifications of different production processes. Some of it might be passive, a lot of learning by doing going on. And this is going to fuel into improving your production processes through know-how and actual better management practices on the floor. If you think about the demand side, it might allow you to actually market and distribute your product better. So it's more about market expertise rather than production expertise per se. And then finally, this kind of knowledge transfer can support follow-on innovation. Lastly, when we think about fragmenting production, it's worth remembering what that means. We're splitting different tasks of the supply chain. And if you change the span of tasks that you choose to produce, it's not just business as usual. Presumably, different tasks require different quality labor, different skills, different managerial practices, different ways of just running your operations. And so participating in global value chains might imply these additional changes within firms. So these are the opportunities for growth. What are some of the obstacles? Well, in order to capitalize on these opportunities, you need to have the knowledge of how to enter global value chains or how to initiate technology upgrading. Once you know how to, or once you know what is out there, then you have to have the capability to actually do it. And that might require management practices. And finally, you have to have an incentive to upgrade. And that's obviously a cost and return comparison. So what are the costs to participating in global value chains or innovating? Well, the literature suggests there are really high matching and transaction costs when you participate in firm-to-firm production networks. There's obviously the cost of sourcing inputs and distribution, and of course the cost of innovation. And you have to weigh those costs against the potential returns. So when we think about the returns to innovation, it is important to know, is the market structure supportive, right? Is enough market competition there such that should you innovate, you will actually be able to reap some profits from being more competitive. Market access to foreign countries helps with that. So if you were to map these challenges to prerequisites at the firm level and those at the market or institutional level, what would they be? And I make that distinction because whatever is at the firm level is something amenable to firm level interventions. And by changing incentives, firms themselves might actually get there. Whatever is at the more aggregate level, be it institutional design or market regulation, that's not something that an individual firm can fix. That is where we require either the market to, the equilibrium to function differently, or you actually need institutional change. Okay? So at the firm level, what matters is know-how, management competence, the ability to produce efficiently, so holding quality constant, produce at low cost, but also the capacity to produce higher quality. So holding, your efficiency constant, are you able to take in higher quality inputs and successfully convert them into a higher quality product? I've done a bunch of work in a series of papers documenting that in terms of firm performance, these are really important drivers. So the most successful exporters are the ones that are actually sourcing inputs from abroad that are of higher quality and conditional on quality of lower cost. And they are in turn able to export abroad goods of higher quality at lower marginal cost. And what's critical to having this production efficiently and quality capacity is adopting effective management practices. So typically in economics, we think of productivity as being this black box TFP, but in fact, there's interesting evidence that management, something very tangible with very clear managerial kind of prerogatives, is something that can improve measured TFP. So I've done some work there with Nick Bloom, John Van Reenen, that actually even uses data from India showing that management interventions work and have long-lasting effects on firm performance. At the market and institutional level, what do you need? Well, you need well-functioning markets on the input side, well-functioning markets for capital and labor, and on the output side, competitive, well-functioning product markets. I've done a lot of research looking at the impact of financial frictions on firms' ability to participate in trade and multinational activity. Within that line of work, something that I'm working on currently is actually thinking about insurance. So, I and others have shown tremendous evidence that access to finance is really critical for the ability to export because of the associated costs and liquidity needs. But some markets are simply too risky for private financial institutions to be willing to support activity there. And I'm currently studying the role that private insurance companies can play in overcoming that risk challenge, and also the role of publicly sponsored export credit agencies in covering the kind of riskiest segment of the business that even private insurance companies are not willing to take on. In other work, I've been looking at how competitive markets upstream enable downstream firms to source products at lower cost. So essentially, as a buyer, if you're sourcing inputs from all suppliers, they're sort of competing with each other, and each one of them is going to have an incentive to set a lower markup. Of course, you're going to benefit from having a lower input cost index. So this is just one manifestation of how more efficient markets can improve performance, and how that can importantly interact with the nature of this global fragmentation, the value chain. I think there's scope to do more work in another direction that is underexplored, and that's the role of essentially intermediaries. So in this literature on global production networks, people have made great progress in thinking about firm-to-firm transactions. But we typically think of there being some search and matching and transaction costs in the background that are a bit of a black box. And I think the next frontier would be unpacking what that is. And one way to get at that is to actually think about, well, how has the market responded to the needs of buyers and suppliers, manufacturers, right? And the way the market has responded is by providing specialized intermediation services. So this could be for transportation, or for logistics, or for contracting. I'm doing some work in that context, looking at the role of trade intermediaries in enabling more firm-to-firm connections. This is using Chilean data. Okay, these are the opportunities for global growth, some of the challenges to tackle. Well, what's happening in practice? Well, I think we have pivoted from the 20th century model to kind of 21st century reality. In the 20th century, kind of the paradigm was that Western countries and multinationals headquartered in the West innovate in the West. And essentially cutting edge research and development happens in the West. And it might then carry over to emerging economies. A lot of these spillovers were mediated by multinationals having foreign production and essentially training their affiliates. There's been a lot of evidence of spillovers from these multinational affiliates to other local firms, be it in the same sector or upstream, essentially input suppliers, or downstream firms buying inputs from these multinationals. I think that is, of course, still going on. It's not to be underestimated. But what is new about the 21st century is the fact that a lot of emerging economies are caught up at the frontier and are able to innovate at the frontier. So this is not to say that everybody is there. In countries such as India and China, of course, there's going to be tremendous firm heterogeneity, even exceeding that exists in rich economies. But there will be some firms that are capable and are effectively innovating at the frontier. So this is just a trivial illustration of that, just an anecdotal piece of evidence. AutoX is a Chinese company. There's several that are working on AI-enabled cars and generally sort of high-tech car stuff. And of course, they have a lot of competitors in the US, and in this particular case, they sort of bet them to the punch, and they introduced these driverless cars. It was a test, of course, in California and later in China, half a year to a year before the American competitor. Okay, so this was kind of like my setup. Now what I'd like to do is walk you through an overview of a few different projects that I've been kind of working on in order to understand these questions from different angles. And essentially, I'll first think about how globalization, global value chains in particular, enable technological change within firms. I'll first start by thinking about standalone firms, and then talk about innovation within multinational firms that have production and innovation operations across the globe. So that's technological change within firms. And then I will also think about spillovers, technological spillovers across firms, which can be another source of aggregate growth. Okay, so first, how does production fragmentation change technological process inside firms? Quick sound bites about a few different things that I do think kind of link up. So the first piece of the evidence comes from what we know from actual production networks. This is using VAT data for the domestic economy in Belgium. A few other countries have similar data. And it's amazing to be able to see what each firm buys from all other firms in the economy or sells downstream to its buyers. And what you see is that being able to source inputs from more suppliers does correspond to having a lower input cost index, in turn that lowers your overall marginal cost and allows you to be more competitive. And there is important sorting here. So firms that are themselves more productive, more efficient, are the ones that are matching more widely with upstream suppliers and essentially benefiting from an even greater reduction in their input cost index. Phase downstream, these productive firms are also going to be the ones that are capturing bigger shares of the downstream sales market. In some work that I'm currently doing, and that's why it's 202 question mark, I'm actually looking at a different economy. So instead of Belgium, I'm looking at Brazil. So you could think of those countries spanning different segments of development or GVC positioning. In the Brazilian context, we have a little bit more information about the nature of these firm-to-firm linkages. You don't just observe the firm identity and the value of the transaction. On top of that, you also see the actual product traded with price and quantity information. And you can extract more from that kind of rich data. On top of that, we can merge in detailed information on employer-employee matches. And essentially, the story that's emerging from that is that when firms outsource certain inputs, they are effectively choosing what tasks to retain in-house and what tasks to outsource. And the picture that's emerging is that successful firms retain in-house the more complex tasks that are performed by higher skilled workers who are compensated at higher wages, and they tend to outsource sort of lower skill tasks, which are then sourced from upstream suppliers. But there is a sortativity in the sense that even though you're outsourcing sort of on average low skill intensive tasks, you do tend to match with better suppliers. And this has implications for, essentially the employment structure. And what we're currently trying to understand is whether that shapes the labor share. So in the macro literature, there's been a lot of interest in, changes in the labor share over time, decline in the labor share. What we're essentially trying to understand is whether some of that is A, mechanical because of global value chains, and B, if it's not, which it isn't, what are exactly the channels? Why is it that global value chains might be contributing to this decline in the labor share? And then another project, again, kind of quite a different take on these issues, looking at data for China, which of course we know is heavily involved in processing trade, the plan for the world. And essentially the way they collect trade statistics is very revealing, because for each import and export transactions, you have these little flags which tell you if this transaction was under the processing regime or the ordinary trade regime. We can also use information from input-output tables, this is a common practice in this literature, to figure out how upstream a given product is. How often does it have to go through other sectors before it reaches a final consumer? So for example, a car is a very downstream product, it's one step away from a consumer. Copper is very upstream, rubber is very upstream, and everything else is sort of in between. So essentially combining this kind of information with panel data, we can track firms over time and understand how their performance evolves with their participation in global value chains. And the takeaway from that line of research is that firms essentially start out small, and in time, as they gain in experience and productivity and size, they're able to expand the value along the value chain and capture progressively wider segments of the value chain, which are also more profitable in turn. So kind of together, I think these three different projects piece this uniform takeaway message that essentially the fragmentation of production enables technological change within firms. I would not describe the technological change as innovation. I'll describe it as just, well, you're changing the task you're producing, and therefore the production technology is slightly different, but you're not like innovating new ways of doing stuff. So let's think about innovating new ways of doing stuff, okay? And let's start by thinking about multinationals, because historically they have been the world innovators. This is actually going to be the project that I'll later go into more depth, so I'll be quite brief now. This is a study that thinks about German multinationals. Germany is, one of the leaders, not just top 3 trade economies, but also a hub for outbound FDI and clearly a global innovation leader. So it is an interesting context to study. And, you know, German multinationals increasingly offshore innovation. In the past, a lot of this evidence on innovation has been based on R&D records. They're proverbially incomplete and a lot of missing values. And R&D is also one of these kind of activities that you don't know what comes out of it. It's sort of like the investment phase as opposed to the realization of that investment. And instead, what we're doing in this project is capitalizing on information on patents. There's a separate literature in innovation that uses very, very rich data on patents. Patents are filed by firms in different patent offices around the globe, and you have a lot of information about each patent. You know who owns it and where it was invented. So it could be a German-owned patent that was invented in India or in Germany or in the US, and you know that, okay? So here are some anecdotes. German multinationals, you know, increasingly offshore innovations, in other words, invent patents or set up R&D plants abroad. And you might think it's just happening in the rich West. So here is a plant that Mercedes-Benz opened in Seattle to develop things like digital cloud computing and that kind of stuff. But increasingly, they're also offshoring patent-generating innovation to countries that we typically think of as poorer or emerging economies, right? So here is another German car brand, BMW, opening a major R&D plant in China. And it's not doing, you know, basic stuff. It is also working on automotive design and digitally enabled, kind of AI-enabled and so on cars, okay? So this is just anecdotal evidence. I'll present that paper more carefully in a moment. But one of the evidences that's coming out of that project is that when multinationals think about where to locate their global innovative activity, they follow comparative advantage stories. So just like we are used to thinking about comparative advantage in production, you're going to offshore low skill intensive stages of production to countries that are low skill abundant and therefore have relatively cheaper low skill labor force, right? In the same spirit, when you offshore innovation activities, you will follow comparative advantage in innovation capacity. And using the patent data, we can see globally, using kind of all patents produced globally, you know, patents are classified by technological areas, a bit like sectors. You know the location, the country where they were invented, so you can calculate measures of reviewed comparative advantage for each technological area in each country. Okay, and when you look at the patterns in the data, firms do follow comparative advantage when offshoring their innovation. Just to pick your interest, you know, what are the top 5 hubs for German multinationals offshoring abroad, you know, outside of Germany? Well, they go to the US, Austria, France, Switzerland, the UK. No surprises there, perhaps, but China and India are in the top 5 and top 15, and this actually happened in the last, let's say, 5 years. So what this figure shows on the horizontal axis is average GDP per capita. Each dot is the country, and on the vertical axis you have the number of patents invented in that location. So it's really spread out across the income distribution. Okay, so we talked about innovation by, you know, Western firms that might be happening at home or abroad. What about innovation by emerging economies? Well, they clearly are pioneers there. And here I have another project looking at patent data, but this time looking at the patent activity of Chinese firms in the US. So the first takeaway from that project is that China, and this is actually exemplary of other emerging economies, have been patenting more and more often in the US, which we interpret as evidence that they're also just improving their innovative capacity. So this is illustrated here with the rise in the white bar on that histogram from 2001 to 2015, where these days about 1,000 Chinese patents are filed with the US Patent Authority each year. And this kind of traces nicely the dotted line, which is the rise in export activity in China since joining the WTO in 2001. One thing we analyzed in this project is how obtaining a US patent improves Chinese firms' export performance. The reason we did that was because our prior was that it's probably going to increase your market share in the US. In principle, a patent grants you market protection only in the authority, in the jurisdiction where the patent is registered, not elsewhere. And in the data, you do see a bit of an effect, but very small. Instead, the vast majority, there's 18% rise in exports worldwide after getting the patent in the US. So we do different cuts of the data, and essentially the conclusion that comes out of this analysis is that it's associated with signaling. Even though some Chinese firms are capable at innovating at the frontier, China is an economy where you have tremendous asymmetric information and really extensive firm heterogeneity. So from the perspective of a foreign buyer, this asymmetric information is problematic, and essentially highly regarded patent authority, like the US one, gives you a stamp of approval that, yeah, this firm is up to scratch. So it signals the ability to produce at high quality and the ability to honor contractual obligations. So this was so the figure on the right is just the event study evidence of the 18% increase in exports. This was kind of my overview. Oh, I forgot one last thing. So I first said, fragmentation of production implies technological change within the firm. Globalization, partly because of fragmentation of production, enables innovation activity within a firm for both multinationals and emerging economies. And then the last one I wanted to mention is spillovers, so technological spillovers across firms. In this particular case, I've been looking at Brazil and looking at spillovers from multinational affiliates to local firms. In the same vein that I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of evidence of these kind of productivity externalities. Here, however, we're looking specifically at environmental practices. So for Brazil, there's some really great data on emissions of 5 different pollutants. I forgot them all, but it's carbon dioxide, nitrate oxide, whatever, something with sulfur. And we're looking at firm level emission outcomes over a long panel and relating that to multinational activity. Intriguingly, for Brazil, as I mentioned earlier, there is very good data on the labor market, employer-employee matched data. So first, what we find is that areas of Brazil with higher presence of multinationals have better emission outcomes. So first of all, we show that multinational affiliates are on average greener than domestic firms. You might say, well, they have outsourced the dirty stuff, kept in-house only the clean stuff. No, even if you look at the overall emission outcomes for the region, combining domestic and foreign, it's improved. Then we try to understand the mechanisms, and that's where we rely on this labor data. And what we're finding is that these knowledge transfer are mediated through labor market turnover. So essentially, domestic firms that hire staff away from a multinational company are able to subsequently improve their environmental practices. So we think this is, again, a very positive message of innovation spillovers, but specifically for a burning question, burning pun intended, right, about climate change. So that was kind of my overview. How am I doing on time? I still have, what did we say, another 20 minutes? I forgot what we said. Okay, great. I am happy to take questions now and at the end, but maybe I should keep going and then happy to take questions then, and I'll make sure to save enough time. Okay, so I've given you this sort of overall context. Now we're going to zoom in on one particular project that I think actually is a good way of thinking about many of the issues I've brought up. So let's think about the innovation of multinationals. So why do we care about this? So multinationals are the core of these two global phenomena, the globalization of production and the globalization of innovation. And understanding how they make their kind of global production innovation decisions jointly is important because of policy design. So a lot of countries look to multinationals as a source of capital transfer and knowledge transfer. And increasingly, when you design trade policy, you design it in tandem with investment policy and innovation policy. These things are all kind of feed into each other. And yet, if you look at the literature, there's been extensive work on the global organization of multinational production and its ownership, not very much on innovation. So that's where we come in. So what we're going to do is exploit great data for Germany. Generally, it's very hard to have information on multinationals. The only two countries that have systematic such data are the US and Germany. At least the good news is that those are two important origins of multinational activity. So for the German multinationals, you know everything about the headquarters in terms of the balance sheets, the locations of all of their foreign affiliates, and you know the balance sheets of those foreign affiliates. And we can then merge that data with PatStat, which is the standard source of patent statistics, and look at where these same German multinationals have, well, the patents that these German multinationals have filed to begin with. Nobody has actually documented the patent activity of multinationals before. And then also see where they actually produce those patents. So we are going to document some stylized facts and then use them to motivate this integrated model of the global production and innovation activity of multinationals. There are interesting decisions here to be made. So firms need to decide where to locate production affiliates and where to conduct two types of innovation. We make this distinction between basic innovation and applied. This is inspired by patterns in the data, but also by findings in the prior innovation literature. The patent data is quite rich, and one piece of evidence is citations. So when you submit a patent application, you actually cite others, you know, you're stepping on the shoulders of giants, right? So you're citing other relevant patents. And in this innovation literature, they have found a way of classifying patents into basic and applied, depending on how far away you are from basic science. So if you yourself cite a scientific journal like Science or Nature, you're considered basic. If you cite another patent that cited a scientific journal, basic. So if you're basically 1 or 2 steps away from a scientific journal publication, you're considered a basic patent. Otherwise, you're considered applied. You know, and things are robust to different classifications, but that's kind of the standard classification. And what we find in the data are some striking irregularities, and so we want to model them. The difference between basic and applied is that applied is something that allows you to improve your efficiency today and forever, and so it immediately benefits your profits. Basic innovation is essentially preparation for future successful applied innovation. So that's essentially the distinction we have in mind. And it's going to have different synergies with production. Applied innovation is going to have cost synergies when it's co-located with production. Think of that as, you know, the floor manager says, this is not working. Goes to the scientist and says, can you do something about it, as in like tomorrow. And once the R&D technician has something to offer, they do the beta test runs back and forth, a much streamlined implementation and the such. So there are cost synergies when you physically co-locate applied innovation and production. Basic innovation doesn't matter. Think of it as a pharmaceutical company. I invent a new gas process today, a new chemical reaction. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but I have a new way of doing this reaction. And maybe tomorrow, my product manager comes and tells me, you know what, there's this great demand for a new vitamin pack. People want to be taking biotin and keratin and whatever together. We don't know how to do it. And the scientist tells you, guess what? I have just the thing for you, because last year I invented this new chemical reaction. Here is the application. So that's kind of what we have in mind. And so, you know, the model's going to generate a bunch of predictions, and I'll end by showing you reduced or empirical evidence that is in line with that. So that's going to exploit variation across firms and countries and sectors. Let me summarize the results, which are sort of both the empirical and the theoretical findings. The first two patterns think about variation across firms, and then we're going to start unpacking it and thinking about variation across countries within firms and patents. So when you look across firms, you find that bigger and more productive multinationals are more likely to innovate in terms of yes, no, do you file patents? Conditional innovation, they hold more patents of higher quality. How do we measure patent quality? We rely on the innovation literature. I talked about backward citations, which you use to classify patents into basic and applied. Well, there is also information on what's called forward citations. So who cites you? And you always cap that at the 5-year rolling window to make things, you know, apples to apples. And so you count the number of citations, and that becomes a proxy for the quality of your patent. So bigger, more productive multinationals innovate more, and they have patents of more citations. So secondly, if you think about where these firms are innovating, bigger, more productive multinationals are more likely to offshore innovation. So they're going to, you know, the people who invented that patent are going to be somewhere else, not in Germany. When they do offshore innovation, they offshore to more countries. And this is going to include both countries where they operate a production affiliate and countries where they don't have production affiliate. And that's actually quite interesting and something new that we didn't know from the data. So multinationals don't just innovate where they have affiliates, they innovate also where they don't. So then let's start unpacking this a little bit more. Let's look within multinationals across different locations. Multinationals are more likely to innovate at higher intensity in terms of more cited patents in countries with a revealed comparative advantage in that sector. So that's something that I referenced earlier. And finally, all of these results I gave you so far hold for both basic and applied innovation, some small differences in magnitudes. One dimension where they do differ is when you think about the probability of co-locating innovation with production. And here, applied innovation, applied patents are disproportionately more likely to be co-located with the production affiliate compared to basic innovation. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. What I'll do now is show you 3 stylized facts. I'll then give you kind of the bird's eye view of the model, essentially what's the setup, the main mechanisms, the main results, and then show you some of the reduced form evidence. I think we'll be good on time for that, but I'm also happy to skip stuff as we need to. So in terms of facts, these might not be surprising, but we just didn't know this. I think it's really nice to validate some priors with data and hopefully to also show you some stuff that maybe is surprising. So first of all, multinationals do innovate very actively. 30% of German multinationals have at least one patent. I should say we're looking at patents filed with the European Patent Authority. There are a bunch of Germans that only patent with the German Patent Office. So in truth, it's actually even more than 30%. Of those patenting parents, fully 43% offshore innovation. So that perhaps is surprising that you don't just innovate at home, but also around the globe. And at the patent level, that means that 14% of German-owned patents were invented abroad. The second fact is that multinationals innovate in locations both with and without a production affiliate. So, this is the Venn diagram. 57% innovate only at home. 7% innovate both in Germany and in a country where they have production affiliate. So I've labeled that offshore co-located. Another 17% innovate at home and in a location without a production affiliate. And then fully 16% innovate in all 3 types of locations. Okay? So quite interesting. And the last fact, again, this one might not surprise you, but we just didn't know it. Bigger firms innovate more intensively. So here, what I'm showing you are bin scatter plots. I have binned multinationals in 10 bins based on their global sales as a proxy for size. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing total number of patents. So bigger firms hold more patents. On the right-hand side is a metric of patent quality. So bigger firms have more cited patents. So these are the 3 facts. So now let's go to the model. There's going to be a bunch of math, or a bunch of notation, I should say, not math, but notation on the slides. Don't look at it if it's Saturday night and it's too much, just listen to me and that's just fine. And so it's an integrated model of production and innovation. There are 2 types of labor. That's an important departure. There are workers who manufacture and there are workers who can innovate, essentially the R&D scientists. And we're going to be keeping track of wages for both. And we want to think about a world with at least 3 countries, so that we can, consider headquarters in one location, production affiliate in another, and a potential 3rd location with no production affiliate. So essentially, think of it as the decision made by a firm headquartered in the West, who is considering where to locate a production affiliate and whether to innovate abroad. We want to make this problem interesting, so we're just going to make sure that East and South are somehow different. And so we're going to make South have a comparative advantage in production compared to East and West. That's kind of normal. And then we're going to make sure that East has a comparative advantage in innovation, so that Southern is not just the hub for everything. The production technology is very standard in the international economics literature. So firms have constant marginal production costs, but there are economies of scale. There are a bunch of fixed costs in the background. Usually when we are interested in where firms locate production facilities, we keep track of the fixed costs of foreign plants and are very careful also about trade costs. Here we're going to simplify our life just to keep track of less notation, but this doesn't change things qualitatively. So we're going to assume that there are no trade costs and strong economies of scale in production. Why do we do that? So that we can guarantee that multinationals optimally concentrate production in one foreign location. If we have 3 countries, we want to make sure that South is a location with a production affiliate and East doesn't have a production affiliate, just so we can make those distinctions. If you have more countries, then you can have location, we can have production in multiple countries as well. Innovation is where the action is. So I already discussed, these 2 types of applied and basic innovation, and I gave you the example from pharmaceuticals. We're going to operationalize this in a static model where everything is amortized per period. So if you think of basic innovation as something that enables future applied innovation, the way you can think of that is that it improves your probability of survival, or it improves the present value of the future expected profit stream. So the firm, we know, has chosen to locate production in the South and is now figuring out where to innovate and how much. In principle, it can innovate in all 3 locations, and there will be interesting interdependencies across locations. This has been on policymakers' minds. So from the perspective of developed countries, there is a bit of a concern that if you offshore innovation, you will no longer be innovating at home. In fact, one of my co-authors, Monika Schnitzer, she's a fantastic German economist. As it so happens, for the last few years, she's also been on the German Council of Economic Advisors. And so she knows this firsthand, that this is, for some reason or other, very high on policymakers' minds. And a sort of a takeaway from our analysis will be that actually, not to worry, there are actually complementarities in innovation across locations. So in this model, it is important that you allow firms to innovate in multiple locations. So this is the firm problem. Now I'll walk you through it, but you can just listen to me if you don't want to stare at notation. So firms are maximizing profits. This is the present discounted value of the future stream of profits. So essentially what you have here are variable profits. So price times quantity is your sales. The other term is your total variable cost. Your productivity is phi in the denominator, the wage where you produce in the numerator. And the term in blue is the benefit from applied innovation. The more applied innovation you do, the lower your marginal production cost is. And notice that applied innovation, the benefits are additive across locations. You do a bit here, a bit there, anyone can then benefit from more your total worldwide applied innovation, okay? Basic innovation increases the present discounted value of these variable profits, okay? That's how the reduced-form way of making this, instead of having a fully blown dynamic model. And again, it's also additive across locations. You do a bit here, a bit there, a bit in Switzerland, a bit in the US, all of that helps you for the future. And then finally, we have some boring costs. They're fixed costs at the headquarters level or the affiliate level. If you're innovating, there's some fixed innovation costs and some variable innovation costs. The variable innovation costs depend on quality. So if you want to innovate higher quality patents, it's going to be more expensive. The fixed costs are important for us as well. We're going to make a couple of assumptions. So first of all, the fixed costs of innovation are higher if you innovate abroad than at home. And this is quite common in this literature when thinking about managing foreign production operations. The idea being that communicating specifications across the border, monitoring all those kind of issues are more difficult at an arm's length, or sort of across the board, not at an arm's length. And we're also going to assume that these fixed costs of innovation, for basic innovation, it doesn't matter where you do them, whether you have an affiliate or not. For applied innovation, that's where there's going to be this cost synergy we discussed. So the fixed costs of applied innovation are lower if you happen to have a production affiliate in the same location. So that's the model in a nutshell. So I'm just going to go straight to results, but in fact, I already gave you this. So it's more about piecing this together and clarifying what the driving mechanisms are. So first, we get this prediction that more productive multinationals are more likely to innovate, and when they do, they innovate at high quality. And the reason is that profits are supermodular in productivity and innovation quality. Supermodularity is one of these fancy words for just double derivative. It's positive. So secondly, more productive multinationals are more likely to offshore innovation. Why? Because they're fixed cost to innovation, and so the usual economies of scale are kicking in. And conditional on offshoring, you're more likely to go to multiple locations because there are separate fixed costs in each location. As a corollary to that, remember in our 3-country setup, you have a production affiliate in only one country, not in the other. And so if you are to innovate in more locations, it's more likely this is going to spend a mix. Some locations with affiliates, some without. So that's kind of how we can match that empirical pattern as well. Then kind of delving into the decisions at the firm level, think about where you innovate across countries. For each firm, it might be optimal to move innovation to a country where the innovator costs are lower. So essentially, that's the result that multinationals are going to follow innovation wages. The way I presented the model, it was just set up with one sector, but you can easily expand that to be firms active in multiple sectors. And if they're thinking about innovation in different sectors, well, they will follow comparative advantage. For each of the technological areas they want to innovate in, they'll go to the country that's good at it. Okay? And then finally, this result that we built into the model by assumption, essentially, that if you're co-locating applied innovation with production, the fixed costs of innovation are going to be lower than if you don't co-locate. And this is not true for basic. For basic, it doesn't matter whether you have production affiliate because you're not really talking to the production plant manager. So that's the model. And finally, the empirical results. I should stop. Yeah, let me wrap up. So it's a simple OLS regression. We're running it at 3 levels of aggregation. I like mnemonics, and so if you look at the subscripts, they're going to tell you everything. So the first set of regressions are sort of at the firm year level, FT, and the question is, are bigger, more productive multinationals more likely to innovate with appropriate sector and year fixed effects? Then we're going to unpack that and go to FACT, which is a firm technology area, country and time. And now the question is whether countries revealed comparative advantage matters for the pattern of patent activity. And then the final specification is going to be the most granular level at the patent level. So FPT is sort of at the patent level. And there what we really care about is whether or not you're co-locating a patent where you're co-locating innovation with a production facility. Okay, so let me go to those results. So first, innovation intensity. So remember, this is at the firm year level with appropriate fixed effects. And bigger multinationals are more likely to innovate. They're more likely to hold at least one patent. When you focus on the intensive margin of those that do patent, they hold more patents of higher average citations. This is going to be true of both basic and applied, so I'm just going to skip that slide. We next go to innovation offshoring, and here we can look at the data in different ways. So first we can ask, if you're bigger, are you more likely to have any patents invented abroad? Yes, no. Okay? And the answer is yes. Again, it doesn't really matter if you're looking at all patents or both basic and applied, or each of basic and applied separately. You might say, well, look, if these guys are bigger, they're probably just innovating more everywhere, both at home and abroad. So is this really a model about offshoring innovation? And the answer is yes, because in a multi-country world with additive fixed costs per location, if you're active in more locations, right, the share of your total patents that's offshore will go up. So you're not scaling things proportionately, at home and abroad. You are actually disproportionately increasing offshore innovation compared to home innovation. So this is what the bottom line shows you. What percent, what share of your patents were produced abroad. That is increasing in firm size. I'm going to skip this and go to revealed comparative advantage across countries. So now we've gone down a level to the firm technology class country level. And we're asking, well, how many patents do you innovate in a given country technology class? And how cited are these patents? How high quality are they? Very clearly in the data, countries that tend to produce a lot of patents in that technology class, so countries with a revealed comparative advantage in that technology class, attract a lot more multinational innovation by German multinationals. So different specifications include different controls, but that's the takeaway message. And then the final result is at the most granular level, at the patent level. where we look at whether firms are co-locating production with innovation. I should have mentioned the previous slide has firm fixed effects as well. So you're really looking within a firm across countries. And likewise here, all the even columns have firm fixed effects. So you're asking within a firm across patents, are you more likely to co-locate your applied innovation with a production facility than basic innovation? And the answer is yes. So let me stop here and essentially ask some open questions, which is I think where this literature has a lot of promise. I've been talking about innovation and growth in the most standard, powerful but standard way that we economists think about it. And of course what is on policymakers' minds here is what I would label growth plus objectives. And I don't think that there is consensus over what are these broader objectives, let alone this terminology, but this is how I think about it. And so I say plus because I think there are like 3 additional dimensions beyond just simple, GDP per capita growth. So the first is, this notion of inclusivity, where you can think about equality in different ways. People talk about resilience and sustainability. A lot of terms kind of get mixed up. So in my mind, at least, I try to draw a map, a linguistic map. And so for me, resilience is, can you carry on at a good pace, okay? So you can think about the first moment, is output stable or are you like super volatile? And what about the second moment, the slope? Is your growth steady or is it like you're growing a lot one year and then you're very sluggish the next and so on, okay? So to me, when I want to say resilience, to me, it's still sort of an economic thing. And then the last one, sustainability, is where I kind of want to open it up and think about stuff that's beyond economic outcomes. So thinking about stable institutions, social cohesion, and of course, climate health, okay? So, really broad objectives, but I think that they are open questions that we cannot ask separately from questions of standard growth and innovation objectives. And I think that's where there's a lot of scope for multilateralism and deep integration. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. And I'm going to make this argument that because we're more interconnected, we are more interdependent, but we're also more interconnected. And interdependent usually draws these negative associations because of shock transmission and shock exposure and supply chain bottlenecks. But I think interconnected is perhaps a better way of describing it because that's a neutral term. These interconnections create opportunities, they create challenges. But I think it's important to appreciate both sides of the coin. And because we're facing global challenges such as climate change or inequality, we need to tackle them as a world together. I don't think we can do stuff unilaterally, and climate is obviously a clear example of that. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that it does align incentives. It's not just tit for tat or beggar thy neighbor. I mean, if you burn more coal here, we're all gonna suffer. And so I think global challenges will hopefully incentivize a global action. And then in turn, to me, it has to be deep because it's not just about, zero trade barriers or this or that. And I'm not even going to use the word integration. I'm happy with coordination or cooperation. So the goal is not to get to some kind of zero tariff or zero whatever. The goal is to some kind of synchronicity towards this global objective of global growth and climate change. So I will stop here. I'm available for as long as you want me to be here for questions, but thank you for your time.
So in your introduction, you mentioned that fragmentation may decrease costs and increase quality. I understand that it may decrease costs, but in terms of the quality, is the story just simply innovation, or do you have other mechanisms in mind how you can climb the quality ladder? And the second question is, in the model, you introduce basic innovation in the profits of the firm. That's also I have difficulties understanding it because basically basic is that it cannot be applied, right, by definition. So what is the mechanism or the channel that you have?
Shall I answer as a, yeah, perfect. So thanks for these questions, great points. So on the first one, what I had in mind in terms of quality, there are different models of how quality is produced. Some of them think about complexity. So if you have a printer that can print and fax and scan, it's going to need more parts. If it's just to print, then it's going to need fewer parts. So essentially, it's the same as having access to more differentiated inputs. So kind of greater input variety can enable producing more complex, higher quality product. But often it's also about the quality of the individual input. So for example, you can make a silk dress with a mother of pearl buttons. The inputs are going to cost more, the output's going to cost more. And if you liberalize imports, you're going to have access to these kind of inputs. Maybe you already had them at home, but at a higher price. And so essentially, liberalizing gives you more access to higher quality goods if you didn't have them, or higher quality goods that you already have, but at a lower price. It's a weekly better situation. That's kind of what I had in mind. On the basic and applied, I think of basic as something that enables future applied innovation. So that's the way that we formulated it. But it does seem to also match how this literature classifies patents in the data. So if you are citing a scientific journal, it's highly unlikely that you're going to take this to the market next year. It's probably going to be an input to future patents that are actually really targeting the market delivery. So that's kind of why we thought of this dynamic feature of the basic innovation, whereas applied innovation is something that is immediately deployed.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Manova. Let me get, so my question is a little bit sort of broader or theoretical, if you like. Let me start. It begins with this word coordination that you used at the very end, but not so much in terms of coordination between governments. Suppose we go back to Smith, and there is this question about what limits specialization. And for him, it's the extent of the market, right? And then you had this slide on what are the challenges that come with integration, which should potentially limit integration. One other question that comes to my mind is that presumably with greater sort of fragmentation of production processes, you need greater coordination between these firms which are spread all over the world, right? And presumably all this coordination is happening in two ways. One is the price mechanism, the other is kind of emails, memos, talking between firms. It seems to me that I don't know, in some senses, the coordination itself would be a challenge which would bring this, or limit the extent of fragmentation. No? Because we are at a point, if you cannot coordinate, then fragmentation is worse than not fragmenting your production process. So, have you looked at this question? Is there anything in the data which tells us the price mechanism or the price system has grown? This is nothing like the world that Smith was speaking about. So is the invisible hand more powerful now? Is it become more muscular? Is it able to lift the fragmentation and coordination problems that modern fragmentation creates? For me, from my point of view, that's really the sort of big hurdle. But the thing is, I don't think we see it as clearly because it's getting solved at the level of the system. Not so much at the level of individual firms.
So I think this may be almost more of a semantics question than a conceptual question. So I think there's just two different meanings of the word coordination that we use in economics. You're absolutely right. One is sort of how firms communicate with each other and coordinate this fragmentation of production. And you're absolutely right that we do need to understand that technology better. So when I talked about intermediaries at some point, that's kind of what I had in mind. What is this black box of we keep saying that searching and matching and transaction costs are worse at a distance or across the border. And I think trying to understand the role that these intermediaries play helps explain that. Often it has to do with the contractual frictions. So even in the work that I've done on financial frictions, sort of the important rationale there is this asymmetric information. So you can't monitor what's happening across the border. If one of the parties is at fault, it's not clear which jurisdiction is going to be responsible for sorting out the mess. And in fact, it's interesting, when you sign a contract with a foreign buyer or supplier, you can't specify which jurisdiction this contract is filed with. And it could be the exporter, the importer, or a third country. So apparently, like Belgium, it has one of these kind of untriport jurisdiction countries for that reason. So coordination at that level, I agree, is sort of a firm level problem that ultimately has to do with, well, what are the frictions? And is the private sector stepping in to resolve them, such as this intermediation sector? or is it something that requires any kind of policy intervention? And I think policy intervention would be warranted to the extent that there are these contractual frictions that could be eased out. So, you know, living in London, I've heard enough of Brexit talk, but I think this is one of the issues, right? So at the end of the day, tariffs are zero, but the non-tariff barriers have become really big. And then, so that's kind of the first word, coordination. But the second meaning of coordination is sort of how we think about, coordinating on multilateral agreements. And what I had in mind there is that to the extent that incentives are not aligned, there is the risk of prisoner's dilemma kind of game. And so you need an institution, you need some coordinating mechanism that aligns incentives. WTO provided such a platform for trade negotiations, but given that now the global challenges are not just about trade, but they're sort of much more wide-ranging, it's not clear what the right coordination platform is, and different authorities, different institutions have emerged to resolve that, right? For climate action, for different issues. But that's super important and super helpful, but I'm kind of hoping that because we're facing these common problems, actually incentives will on their own align, and so you're going to be relying less on these kind of coordination mechanisms.
Okay, one last question. Yeah.
Dr. Manova, thank you for the paper. Very interesting results. I just wanted to ask, the results of your analysis come out in a world where MNCs are guided by profit motives. They want to increase returns to their shareholders, and then a lot of results make sense. I just wanted your thoughts on recent geopolitical changes that have happened. We've had trade war beginning 2018. We had talks of nearshoring, friendshoring, and so forth, where the motivations that guide MNC decisions are no longer pure profit driven. So there are, for instance, AMES reports on how GVCs, global value chains, which face higher costs, MNCs particularly, given there is nearshoring and friendshoring. I just wanted to know your thoughts on it.
Thanks for the question. I wish I had time to talk about that myself. So thanks for the opportunity. So I'm going to do the classic economist answer, right? It is all about maximizing profits or utility maximization. You just have to specify the function correctly. And so everything you described, I completely agree is important. I think as economists, we can map all of that to a profit function. For example, when we think about geopolitical tensions, that is essentially risk. And so you could enrich a model where you have some risk of stuff going south, right? So risk of default or risk of, partial delivery on something, or innovation faces some risk of expropriation of affiliate assets, that kind of stuff. And to the extent that geopolitical tensions enter decision makers' minds, I think this is how they think about it. And so in that sense, I think it would enter multinational decision in the same way. There's something beyond that though, and that has to do with the volatility. So in a sense, what I was presenting was nevertheless a static model. And I think rightly, macroeconomists are very concerned about shocks. And supply chain bottlenecks were painfully apparent in the context of COVID and times since. And these geopolitical tensions have been kind of bundled up with these supply chain issues. So I think these comments about, or these thoughts on reshoring and nearshoring are related to that. I don't think it's just we don't want to do anything with such a country per se. It's more about we're worried that tying our business with such a country is going to have volatile implications. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that these debates about, say, fair trade or going green, right? To me, they're actually very similar to how we think about, do I want to support a certain regime? Do I want to support a certain country because of whatever has happened in that economy? Well, if I am accountable to shareholders, I will ask my shareholders, do they care about that? So again, as an economist, we can have ethical preferences enter our utility function. You're just going to put some premium on that. And I think it does enter a lot of consumers' minds. Not everyone, if you can afford it, you think about it. I remember, so I'm originally from Bulgaria, I went to the US in '98, and I remember, already back then, they were concerned about the economy and recycling and this and that, and I was like, oh, this is such a first world problem. Back home, it's about, getting the basics. You don't have time or money to worry about the economy, the environment. And of course, now that I've had the privilege to kind of have a more normal life, of course I worry about those issues as well. So today, I am happy to pay a premium for something that's organic or fair trade to the extent that you can believe the label. Greenwashing isn't a whole other issue. But if you're poor, that's not going to be your primary concern. But I think to back up and answer your question, I think a lot of these concerns about geopolitics we can think about as economists. We have the right toolkit for it.
Okay. Thank you, Kalina. We are out of time.
Yes, thank you so much.
One more question, but perhaps we can ask you. So thanks very much. Let's give a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.